They found fresh water, fertile land, and people marked by generosity and trust. What ended their exploration was not conflict, but a meal that left them helpless. Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. In this podcast, I explore historical journeys and travel accounts that shaped how Europeans came to understand the world. This series follows the second voyage of Captain James Cook and the young naturalist Georg Forster through the Pacific in the 18th century. What happened in the last episode? In the previous episode, the Resolution tacked through the New Hebrides, charting fertile, densely inhabited coasts and entering a vast bay on Tierra del Espíritu Santo, where cautious first contacts revealed shared words and unexpected linguistic boundaries. Cook named the island group the New Hebrides. Soon after, land appeared again, New Caledonia, ringed by reefs and approached through a narrow passage. Inside the calm lagoon, canoes with onboard fires gathered around the ship, and the expedition began careful exchanges, observations, and a search for fresh water among mangroves and river settlements. Tuesday, September 6th, 1774, New Caledonia.
The next morning, the islanders came early to the ship with their boats. On each boat, a fire was burning, safely placed on a pile of stones and ash. Among them were also a few women, but none of them wished to come aboard. The men, however, mostly climbed up without invitation and began trading their weapons for pieces of Tahitian cloth. In search of a closer spot to refill the water barrels, the captain once again sent the boats to shore. Georg and his companions went along. They landed at the same place as the day before and encountered only a few locals. When asked about drinking water, these pointed westward, toward an area that no one had yet explored. Following that direction along the sandy beach, lined with a beautiful fringe of wild bushland, they soon came to a hut behind which several fields had been planted. To examine these more closely, they made a short detour inland, but had to turn back shortly after. A trench built for irrigation blocked their path, and it carried brackish water. They hurried up a nearby hill, hoping to spot a spring from there. The soil here was markedly different. While the plain had only a thin layer of fertile earth, on cultivated plots enriched with crushed shells and pearl-like stones. The subsoil on the hill consisted of large chunks of quartz and horizontal layers of mica, a typical layered rock. The vegetation was sparse. Withered grass grew thinly to a height of about 1 meter. Every 20 to 30 meters stood a lone tree with a blackened trunk and white bark, likely Melaleuca leucadendra, a tree used on the Moluccas for producing Cajeput oil thanks to its fragrant leaves.
Melaleuca leucadendra is an evergreen tree from the myrtle family, originally found in Australia, New Guinea, and the Moluccas. In the 18th century, it was especially valued in the Moluccas for its aromatic leaves. From these leaves, the so-called Cajeput oil was extracted through steam distillation. This oil was highly prized at the time, as it was considered a versatile remedy. It was taken internally for stomach and intestinal complaints, applied externally for relief from muscle pain and rheumatism, and also used to treat skin infections. In addition, it had antiseptic properties and was employed for wound cleaning. In an era without modern medicine, Cajeput oil was a coveted trade item, used both in European medicine and in traditional Southeast Asian healing practices.
Between these widely scattered trees, the view opened up completely. Most striking was a line of shady trees and green bushes stretching from the sea into the mountains. Everything pointed to a stream, and this suspicion was soon confirmed. After crossing a few more cultivated fields, they found a small river flowing beneath the trees. About 200 meters from the beach, the water was already free of salt, perfect for filling the barrels with minimal effort. To the leader, T. Buma, whom they met there, they gave medals and other small gifts and received in return a sling and several clubs. The riverbanks were covered in mangroves, behind which lay a 6-meter-wide strip of rich humus soil, overgrown with green grass, a sight that was especially refreshing after the parched hillsides. The wild, tree and bush-lined strip was particularly fascinating to Georg and his companions as naturalists. There, they discovered numerous unfamiliar plants and many new species of birds from different groups. But more than all this, they were impressed by the friendly and peaceful behavior of the local people. The population lived in scattered settlements, typically with 2 or 3 huts close together, surrounded by tall fig trees. The tightly interwoven branches of these trees allowed barely any sky to shine through. The people enjoyed not only the cool shade, but also the songs of countless birds that gathered in the treetops to escape the heat. They were particularly fond of the gentle call of a species of tree creeper, whose melody delighted anyone with a sense for the harmony of rural sounds. The locals, too, seemed to appreciate it. They often sat beneath these trees, which, in addition to their pleasant coolness, also intrigued the researchers with their unusual structure. The lower trunk of these trees rose 10, 15, even 16 meters above the ground, resting on long roots that extended diagonally to the earth in straight lines. These roots were as round as if turned on a lathe and as elastic as a drawn bowstring. It was likely from the bark of these trees that the piece of brown cloth was made, which stood out in the adornment of the New Caledonians. Their new acquaintances taught Georg and the others many words of their language, yet it bore no resemblance to any known language. That alone was enough to deter even the most enthusiastic genealogist from making further speculations about their origin. As for the character of these people, Georg and his companions soon observed that their warmth and peacefulness were partly accompanied by a natural sluggishness. When the Europeans went walking, the locals rarely followed. If the expedition passed by their huts without greeting them first, they simply let it pass and took no further interest in the strangers. Only the women showed a bit more curiosity. Sometimes they hid in the bushes to observe Georg's group from afar. They were only allowed to approach when accompanied by the men. That the strangers were shooting birds caused no concern among the inhabitants. On the contrary, when the team neared the dwellings, the young people would even search for birds themselves and proudly show them to the visitors. Georg had the impression that the people had little work to do at this time of year. The fields had been planted, the banana trees and taro already set. That was likely the reason why they had less food to offer than usual, although their kind and good-hearted nature would certainly have inclined them to share more if they could. It would be unfair to deny them the hospitality so characteristic of all the peoples of the South Seas, and which made them so precious in the eyes of the traveling stranger. Their walk lasted until nearly midday. Then they returned to the ship with a boatload of fresh water. Only a small group remained ashore to guard the empty barrels, a precaution that, given the honesty of the locals, may well have been unnecessary. During Georg's absence, Mr. Wales had set up several instruments on a small sandy island to observe a solar eclipse that took place on that day. The captain was with him and kept him company. From this and other measurements, the position of the small island was determined to be 20 degrees 17 minutes 39 seconds south latitude and 164 degrees 41 minutes 21 seconds east longitude. However, only the end of the eclipse could be observed, as a cloud had covered the sun at the beginning. Mr. Wales measured the obscured portion using Hadley's quadrant, a device never before used for this purpose, but which, in Captain Cook's estimation, could serve as a highly accurate micrometer.
Hadley's quadrant, also known as the octant, was in the 18th century primarily a navigational instrument used to determine latitude at sea. It was designed to measure the angle between the horizon and celestial bodies like the sun or stars by means of mirrors. Captain Cook, however, discovered a new use that had never been attempted before. He used the quadrant as a kind of micrometer to measure very small angular distances with great precision. This allowed him to determine, for instance, the apparent size of celestial bodies or the distance between them with unusual accuracy. His innovation made the instruments a valuable tool not only for navigation but also for astronomical and scientific observations during his voyages.
Toward evening, they went ashore with the captain to the spot where the water barrels were being filled. The Cajeput trees, Melaleuca, some of which were in bloom, had peeling bark that had come loose from the trunk in several places, providing shelter for beetles, ants, spiders, lizards, and scorpions. The weather was so pleasant that they wandered the nearby hills until sunset. At dusk, they thought they heard quails in the dry grass, but neither that evening nor later were they able to confirm it. Of the few inhabitants in that area, some were so trusting that they were willing to sell their weapons. Georg and the others tried to explain that they were in need of food, but the islanders showed no reaction, apparently because they didn't have enough themselves. The soil here was suitable for cultivation in only a few places. The effort the locals put into farming was seldom rewarded with much yield. On the morning of September 11th, before the islanders came aboard, a boat was sent out to bury one of the crew members according to maritime custom. It was the ship's butcher, who had fallen badly on September 5th and now died from his injuries. He had been a diligent man in his 60s, tireless in his trade, and the third man they had lost on the voyage. One had drowned, another had died of dropsy. After breakfast, Georg, the captain, the chief mate, 2 midshipmen, and 3 sailors went ashore to climb the mountains from which the small river flowed. Although some of the slopes were quite steep, they found accessible paths throughout. The rock consisted of a mixture of quartz and mica, occasionally with iron deposits. Cajeput trees grew everywhere, both on the heights and in the valley. The higher they climbed, the more varied the shrubs became, often in bloom and unknown to the researchers. Toward the summit, the trees grew noticeably smaller. Only in deep ravines, where streams nourished the soil, did the plants grow lush and green. After about an hour, they encountered over 200 islanders, most of them armed, who had come from the interior just to see the strangers. When they realized that Georg's group was taking the same path up that they had just descended, most of them turned around and accompanied them. Not far from the summit, they discovered stakes driven into the ground and covered with dry branches and bundles of grass. The locals explained that this was where they buried their dead, and the stakes marked the graves. The captain and the helmsman eventually reached the summit and were able to look southward all the way to the coast. According to their report, the sea on that side was no farther than it was to the north, and a water-rich plain, partly cultivated, extended at the foot of the mountains. The view was breathtaking. Winding streams, fields and scattered dwellings, clusters of trees and woodlands, combined with the play of color on the shallow sea and sandbanks, created a magnificent panorama. The islanders noticed that the foreigners were thirsty and brought them sugar cane. Georg wondered where they had found it, since nothing of the sort had been visible on the barren slopes. The summit consisted of the same type of rock as the lower levels, which led him to suspect that this land might still hold valuable mineral resources. Based on the duration of the ascent and other clues, the mountain was probably not very high, presumably lower than the so-called Table Mountain at the Cape of Good Hope, whose elevation had been given by Abbé de la Caille as around 1,060 meters. Immediately upon returning to the water station, they went back to the ship. Many islanders had gathered there, inspecting every corner and offering clubs, spears, and all sorts of ornaments for trade. One man stood out in particular. He was at least 1.96 meters tall, and with his tall, upright, rounded black hat, probably over 2.16 meters. Around these hats, they usually tied their slings, letting the tassel hang down onto the shoulders. As decoration, they often added a tuft of fern, or, to appear especially fine, a bunch of feathers from the Ceylon owl, a bird found both here and on the island of Tanna. Despite the high value the New Caledonians placed on these hats, the crew succeeded in trading several of them for pieces of Tahitian cloth. Another striking ornament was the earrings. Some men wore an enormous number. One, for example, had 20 rings made of tortoise shell, each about 2.5 centimeters in diameter and 0.6 centimeters thick. Among the traded items was also a musical instrument, a kind of whistle. It consisted of a 5-centimeter-long piece of wood, bell-shaped but not hollow. At the narrow end, a small string was attached. Near the flat base were 2 holes, with a third hole near the string. All 3 appeared to be connected inside, because blowing into the top hole produced a piercing sound from the others. Apart from this whistle, they found no other instrument among the islanders that could truly be called musical. Large nails now became a common currency for trade. The islanders quickly recognized the value of iron, and soon showed great interest in the round iron bolts used to fasten the ship's ropes. Captain Cook believed they saw these as particularly useful for canoe construction, perhaps to drill holes in the planks and then stitch them together. That the holes were burned in was considered certain, perhaps with heated stones, although the exact tool remained unidentified. Much as they valued the iron bolts, not one among them made the slightest attempt to steal anything. Their behavior remained thoroughly honest. Their swimming abilities amazed everyone. The ship was anchored at least 1.85 kilometers from shore, yet they swam out in groups, holding their piece of brown cloth above water with one hand while paddling with the other.
The swimming abilities described here were not exceptional within the cultural context of the South Pacific. In many island societies, swimming was a fundamental skill learned from early childhood, not a leisure activity, but a form of daily mobility. Distance, currents, and open water posed little fear to people who grew up in close relationship with the sea. Objects were often carried above the water with one hand while the other was used for propulsion, a technique that allowed both endurance and control. To European observers accustomed to ships as the primary means of maritime movement, such confidence appeared astonishing. Yet it reflected not physical extraordinariness, but lifelong adaptation to an environment where land and sea formed a single, continuous living space.
In this strenuous but skillful way, they also brought spears and clubs to the ship. Only weapons made from casuarina wood were too heavy. They had to be transported differently. In the afternoon, they once again set out by boat and landed about 3.7 kilometers from the water source, where the bay ended on the west side in a prominent headland. There, Captain Cook made a few drawings of the anchorage for the benefit of future navigators, while the others continued their investigations. Not far from the shore, they came upon a large, irregular block of gray, fine-grained hornstone, studded with tiny garnet crystals the size of pinheads. This discovery seemed to confirm the suspicion that usable minerals might exist on this island. It was also noteworthy that there was no volcanic rock here, something found on nearly every other island in the South Pacific. The dense brush along the shore enticed them into a botanical walk. They discovered some young breadfruit trees that seemed to be growing wild and had not yet borne fruit. Nearby, they came across a new species of passion flower, remarkable since all previously known species of this genus were native exclusively to the Americas. Georg lost contact with the group and found himself in a sandy gully resembling a dry creek bed, lined with fragrant shrubs and morning glories. He came to 3 huts beneath coconut palms. In front of one, a middle-aged man was sitting with a young girl, about 10 years old, resting her head in his lap. The man was cutting her hair with a sharpened piece of translucent quartz. Georg gave them some black glass beads, which they received with great joy, and he continued on to the other huts. The huts stood so close together that the fenced space between them was barely 3 square meters. There, Georg met 3 women, 1 middle-aged and 2 younger, who were lighting a fire under a large earthen pot. When they noticed him, they waved vigorously for him to go away. But curious to observe their cooking methods, Georg stepped closer. In the pot were dried grass, green leaves, and small yam roots, apparently being baked similarly to the method used on Tahiti, except here it was done in pots instead of in the ground. The women gestured even more urgently. They pointed toward their huts and ran their fingers across their throats, signs Georg interpreted as a warning. If they were seen alone with a foreigner, they could be punished. The gestures were too clear and serious for Georg to ignore. He cast a last glance into the empty huts and withdrew into the bushes, where he ran into Dr. Sparman. Sparman thought Georg had misinterpreted the signs and suggested they return. They went back together and gave the women glass beads, which delighted them, but did not ease their concern. On the contrary, the women now pleaded even more earnestly not to get them into trouble. Georg no longer doubted the meaning of their signs. By then, the rest of the group had caught up and complained of thirst. Georg said nothing about the incident, not wanting to endanger the women if anyone became curious. Instead, he led the group to the man with the quartz tool, who was still trimming the girl's hair. They explained that they were looking for something to drink, which he immediately understood. He pointed to a tree where 12 large coconut shells filled with water hung. This method of water storage hinted at water scarcity, but they quenched their thirst gratefully and rewarded the man with a piece of Tahitian cloth. They returned to the water station in two groups, one by land, the other by boat. Georg joined the land group and shot several new bird species along the way, including the European crow. At the water site, many islanders had gathered. Some of them, for a piece of Tahitian cloth, carried the sailors back through the water to the boat. Among them were women who mingled fearlessly with the men and were quite receptive to the sailors' jokes. They often beckoned the sailors into the bushes, but if anyone followed, they ran off at great speed and laughed at the ones they had tricked. During the entire stay on the island, not a single woman behaved in any improper way with the Europeans. Their seemingly flirtatious behavior remained nothing more than a playful, spirited game. They had only just returned to the ship when the captain's clerk brought a fish that an islander had just speared and traded for a piece of Tahitian cloth. Since it was a new species, Georg immediately set about describing and drawing it. The fish belonged to the genus Tetraodon, some species of which are known to be poisonous. Georg and the others warned Captain Cook, especially as the fish, with its thick head and unpleasant appearance, did little to inspire confidence. The captain, however, replied that he had eaten the same fish before on the coast of New Holland, without any ill effect. They were thus looking forward to their next fresh meal, and, that evening, confidently ate the liver of the fish. It was large, but tasted so unpleasant that the captain, Georg's father, and Georg himself took only a few bites. Dr. Sparman, however, did not touch it at all. Immediately after dinner, they all went to bed early in order to go ashore again at sunrise. But around 3 in the morning, Georg's father woke up, with numb hands and feet. When he tried to get up, he felt dizzy and could barely stand. He dragged himself with great effort to Dr. Sparman in the chart room.
At the time of this voyage, fish poisoning was poorly understood. While island communities possessed detailed local knowledge about which species were dangerous and when, Europeans lacked any systematic framework to interpret such warnings. Symptoms like numbness, paralysis, dizziness, and chest tightness were terrifying not only because their severity, but because their cause remained invisible. Without a knowledge of marine toxins, poisoning appeared sudden, unpredictable, and potentially fatal. The decision to eat the fish's liver, often the most toxic part, reflects this uncertainty. What followed was not merely an illness, but a stark reminder that European confidence in unfamiliar environments could be swiftly overturned by local ecological realities.
Captain Cook's bunk was separated from it by only a thin wall, and he too awoke with the same symptoms. He too could not stand without support. Georg still lay unconscious in his bed, overcome by the numbing dizziness. His father shook him violently awake, and Georg immediately realized how unwell he was. Together they dragged themselves into the cabin and called for the ship's surgeon, Patton. He found them in a highly critical state, deathly pale, exhausted, suffering from severe chest tightness and numb limbs. He first administered emetics. They worked reasonably well for Georg and his father, but had little effect on Captain Cook. After that, they had to take sudorifics and lie down again. At 8 o'clock, they got up, still dazed and with heavy heads. Georg, however, had recovered enough to stay up the entire morning and managed to draw 6 to 8 plants and several birds they had collected during their recent walks. Meanwhile, Dr. Sparman returned to shore to gather more specimens. Around noon, Georg's father tried to go up on deck to speak with the islanders who had come aboard. When they saw the fish hanging below deck, they made gestures to indicate that it caused stomach cramps. They placed their heads in their hands and closed their eyes, a sign for sleep, paralysis, and ultimately, death. Despite how well this matched their own experience, Georg and the others at first suspected the warnings might be exaggerated. Perhaps the islanders simply wanted the fish for themselves. But when they offered it to them, the reaction was unmistakable. They refused with utter disgust, held up their hands in defense, and turned away. They even explicitly begged them to throw the fish into the sea. Instead, they decided to preserve the specimen in alcohol.
Monday, September 12, 1774, New Caledonia.
By midday, Georg had to pay the painful price for having ignored his illness and worked all morning. He was suddenly overcome by nausea and severe dizziness and had to rush back to bed. Sweat-inducing remedies brought him the most relief, but the poison was too strong to be overcome quickly. It wasn't the pain or the concern for their health that struck them the hardest. It was something else entirely. The realization that they were no longer in any condition to continue exploring the new land or studying its nature in greater detail. And yet, they had already had such a promising glimpse of it.
This brings us to the end of this episode of The Journey. What began with promise and discovery ended in illness and forced withdrawal. A reminder of how fragile exploration could be in unfamiliar worlds. Maps and present-day locations connected to this episode can be found via the links in the YouTube show notes leading to the website. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link there as well. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.